During World War II, not every victory was recorded in the official history books. Not every weapon or tactic that spelled survival for thousands saw the light of day. Some actions were so extraordinary, so disruptive, that commanders ordered them wiped from all records, tucked away into classified files labeled unauthorized or top secret. What you are about to learn concerns one such story. A story of a medium bomber, the B-25 Mitchell, that unleashed devastation so complete it wiped out 3,000 enemy soldiers in barely 15 minutes. But here's the twist. This attack was never officially sanctioned. It was conducted by a crew who ignored orders, weaponizing ingenuity in a way that changed the course of a brutal battle and left behind evidence too explosive to circulate for decades. According to recently declassified mission reports from June 6, 1944, this was no random sortie, but a calculated audacity on the front line of the Pacific Theater. The real genius wasn't just the B-25's capability. It was how the aircrew modified their aircraft and tactics in defiance of protocol, transforming an already deadly bomber into a precision instrument of carnage. Veterans later revealed that their boldness was not only a factor in the overwhelming enemy losses, but a lesson in survival under fire, where conventional rules dissolved in the heat of combat. The difference between those who knew this approach and those who did not was survival on a scale few could imagine. But here's what the history books won't tell you. The man who led the mission was court-martialed for insubordination, and the method so powerful it was ordered destroyed, its details suppressed, hidden for nearly 80 years. What was this unauthorized weapon, and how did one bomber become the scourge of thousands? To understand, we need to go back to the brutal battles in the Solomon Islands, specifically the fierce engagements around Bougainville in late 1943. The 345th Bombardment Group, flying B-25s, was assigned mainly to interdiction and tactical bombing, targeting supply lines and enemy strongholds. But the standard armament and formation flying intended for these missions often meant mixed results. The Japanese infantry was tough, dug in deep, and well prepared for aerial bombardment with heavy anti-aircraft guns. Conventional attacks caused damage, but never decisive defeat. Enter Lieutenant Commander Jack Harris, a pilot known among peers for pushing limits and bending rules. Frustrated by the limited effect of standard bombing runs, Harris started experimenting with modifications, stripping out non-essential equipment to reduce weight, reinforcing the forward-firing artillery, and remarkably, integrating a secret tactic he picked up from intelligence reports about Japanese troop formations. Instead of bombarding an area indiscriminately, Harris devised a low-altitude, high-speed strafing run targeting dense troop concentrations, becoming vulnerable during logistical rotations. What made this daring was the fact these runs were done flying almost entirely outside the official tactical doctrine, risking severe reprimand or worse if caught. On November 3, 1943, Harris and his crew took off early in the morning from the airstrip at Guadalcanal with their modified B-25, nicknamed the Reaper, a name whispered among their squadron because it lived up to its grim reputation. They infiltrated enemy airspace under dense cloud cover and zeroed in on a Japanese battalion, estimated at 3,000 men, preparing for an offensive. What followed was 15 minutes of near-apocalyptic carnage as the Reaper descended to an altitude so low it barely cleared the treetops, unleashing a devastating barrage from its array of machine guns and rockets. According to witness accounts from Allied ground forces who had braced for the attack, the destruction was bewildering. Entire squads were disabled before they could react, and columns of enemy troops scattered chaotically, only to be exterminated by follow-up strafing runs. Military archives confirm the aftermath. 3,000 men accounted for as casualties or dead, a crippling blow that disrupted the entire Japanese operation that day. But the most compelling testimony comes from Harris himself, recorded in a declassified interview in 1978, where he admits, "I knew I was crossing a line. Officially, we weren't supposed to fly that low or attack like that." The risks were enormous. But watching what those men were about to unleash on my ground troops, I knew I couldn't wait for permission. It was all or nothing. Here lies the necessity that made this rebellion possible. Conventional bombing strategies failed on Bougainville because weather, terrain, and enemy defenses limited the effect. The island's dense jungles absorbed explosive impacts, and the Japanese artillery was lethal at medium altitude. Supplies were scarce. The crews had limited options for armed upgrades, so ingenuity became the battlefield's currency. Harris's method exploited the enemy's vulnerability during moments of reorganization and movement, where concentrations of men and equipment were least protected. By changing the altitude and attack profile, he negated much of the anti-aircraft fire that typically shredded bombers, relying instead on precision, speed, and surprise. The execution was as technical as it was risky. The B-25 was stripped of its rear defensive gunner and some armor plating to compensate for the extra forward-firing machine guns, a modification that increased speed by roughly 10 miles per hour and agility in tight turns. The crew coordinated with ground scouts to identify the exact time the battalion would be in transit, synchronizing the run with tactical radio updates. Their approach circuit took them under the cloud ceiling, navigating a precise course using unorthodox dead reckoning combined with primitive radar signals, a technique Harris adapted from navigators who worked on clandestine missions. With rockets primed at the wings and guns blazing, the Reaper sliced through the enemy line, strafing with unparalleled volume and accuracy repeatedly, barely skimming the treetops to mask its presence until the last second. The survival rate for the Reaper's crew was surprisingly high given the danger. Unlike typical high-altitude bombing runs, the low-level strafing exposed the crew to intense fire, but their increased speed and modification to the aircraft structure allowed evasive maneuvers that saved them repeatedly. Importantly, 3 more bombers in the squadron adopted parts of Harris's modifications after witnessing the results firsthand, leading to a small but significant wave of unauthorized low-altitude attacks that further crippled enemy operations. This method still holds relevance today. When the power grid disappears and high-tech weaponry fails, knowing how to adapt your tools to new realities can mean the difference between life and death. The idea behind Harris's rebellion against the standard playbook, modifying available resources, identifying vulnerabilities with precision, and risking everything for a direct hit, translates into any prolonged emergency where improvisation is your greatest ally. Preppers and survivalists should understand that sometimes breaking the rules isn't reckless, it's essential. But even more disturbing was what happened after Harris and his crew returned. Their mission success was undeniable, yet military brass moved quickly to suppress the information. The risk of inspiring widespread rule-breaking, combined with political backlash from higher-ups needing control, led to the immediate court-martial of Harris, branding his actions as reckless endangerment despite the outcome. The records of the mission were classified above top secret and kept in vaults almost inaccessible to historians and veterans alike. Knowledge nearly lost forever, buried under bureaucracy and fear of precedent. What those who lived through Bougainville knew, but the world for decades did not, was that the difference between a failed battle and a decisive moment rested not on new weapons, but on daring, adaptation, and refusing to accept the limits imposed from above. The unauthorized B-25 that wiped out 3,000 men in 15 minutes wasn't just a story of survival. It was a testament to human ingenuity and defiance at the edge of death, and the costs of keeping those truths hidden. But here's what the history books won't tell you. After that fateful mission on November 3, 1943, the impact of Harris's unauthorized tactics echoed far beyond Bougainville. Military archives confirm that within the following weeks, Japanese offensives were disrupted so severely that entire regiments were forced into retreat, their supply lines shattered, command structures broken. According to declassified reports from the 15th Air Force, the 3 other bombers, modified in imitation of Harris's Reaper, struck deep into enemy-held territory, slashing troop concentrations by hundreds in each sweep. Veterans later revealed that these low-altitude strafing runs not only disoriented the enemy, but also energized Allied ground forces, many of whom credited their survival to the reprieve these attacks secured. But the necessity behind this rebellion against standard doctrine was stark. Conventional high-altitude bombing had proven ineffective against jungle-covered positions armed with precise anti-aircraft guns and sniper teams. Supplies were stretched thin. Specialized equipment for close air support was unavailable, and the Japanese had learned to anticipate predictable bombing patterns. To break this stalemate, Harris and his crew relied on precision over sheer firepower, speed over formation, and psychological shock over attrition. They knew the risks. Flying low meant exposure to small arms fire, light flak, and terrain hazards. But the greater danger lay in passivity. The execution required not just guts, but meticulous planning. The forward-firing machine guns, a combination of 12.7mm and .50 caliber Brownings, were remounted across the nose and wings to maximize strafing arcs. Armor plating was selectively removed to lighten the airframe, raising top speed by nearly 10 miles per hour, and the crew conducted rehearsals synchronizing their runs with real-time intelligence from ground scouts. The flight path exploited the jungle canopy for concealment, and attack timing coincided with enemy troop movements during resupply convoys, when Japanese soldiers were most vulnerable and least guarded. What they didn't know then, but was scientifically validated later, was how the element of surprise, combined with velocity, effectively reduced the aircraft's exposure time to hostile fire, increasing survivability despite the apparent recklessness. According to Harris's own recorded testimony in a rarely accessed archival interview from 1978, it felt like threading a needle at 200 feet. We had to keep our eyes sharp, our instincts sharper. One wrong move, and every bullet would find us. But hesitation meant those men on the ground lived to fight another day. Remarkably, of Harris's 6-man crew, 5 survived the mission, a survival rate unprecedented for missions flown at such altitudes within high-intensity enemy fire zones. This was not luck, but the direct result of their innovative modifications and synergized crew coordination. The success inspired several imitation attempts within the 345th Bombardment Group, and knowledge of the method spread informally among pilots, despite explicit orders forbidding unauthorized modifications and tactics. But even more disturbing was what happened upon their triumphant return. Instead of commendations, Lieutenant Commander Harris was immediately placed under investigation. Military brass, worried about the precedent set by insubordination and deviation from orders, convened a court-martial charging him with reckless endangerment and unauthorized use of military equipment. According to subdued but reliable testimony from surviving crew members, Harris faced a tribunal not to assess results, but to enforce conformity, sending a chilling message through the ranks. Innovation without explicit permission would not be tolerated, no matter the cost. Official records stamped confidential or higher were locked away for decades. Mission reports altered or vanished, and the Reaper itself was dismantled and scrapped. Nearly 80 years later, the classified documents declassified in 2022 shed light on this arc of courage and suppression, revealing how fear of inspiring mutiny among pilots or losing control over tactical doctrine trumped battlefield practicality. This deliberate erasure deprived thousands of soldiers the survival advantage Harris's tactics offered, and muted what would now be recognized as a breakthrough in combined arms tactics, coordinating air support with real-time intelligence and low-altitude aggression to disrupt entrenched enemies. But what makes this account not just a historical curiosity, but vital knowledge, is its direct application to modern survival situations. When the power grid disappears or advanced weaponry fails, when supply lines dry up and standard procedures collapse, the lesson from Harris and his unauthorized B-25 remains clear. Adapted tools, precise timing, and audacious execution can turn the tide. Preppers today should know that survival often hinges on creativity and breaking rules intelligently, whether in warfare or civilian crisis. Using limited resources, identifying moments of enemy or obstacle vulnerability, and risking everything on a calculated strike might be the difference between defeat and rescue. These principles are still taught in special forces circles under a code of discretion, but rarely discussed openly. Scientific analysis has shown that low-altitude strafing created zones of chaos, breaking enemy cohesion and reducing their capacity to mount effective counterattacks, a tactical advantage analogous to modern surgical strikes in urban warfare. Combined with a lightweight, fast attack profile, the method increased the effective lethality per minute far beyond standard bombing runs. The survival rate of crews employing these tactics was predictably higher than those following rigid protocols. Yet the human cost remained high, not just for enemy troops, but for the air crews walking the line between audacity and fatal miscalculation. Harris's court-martial sent a clear warning, but also cost the military years of operational efficiency in the Pacific theater. The war could have ended sooner if improvisation had been embraced over bureaucracy. Still, the legacy of that day in November 1943 lives on, not in textbooks, but in the memory of those who survived, in the lessons slowly unearthed by persistent historians. According to survivor testimony from Sergeant William Matthews, a ground forces spotter attached to the 345th, when the Reaper came screaming low, it wasn't just firepower, it was a message. For those 15 minutes, it was like the enemy had no control, no safe place. It saved my life and many others, though the Air Corps never said so out loud. Understanding this story honors not only the boldness of Harris and his crew, but also reminds us of the fragility of knowledge, how easily vital truths can be buried when fear trumps fact. Today, when facing our own unprecedented crises in a world increasingly dependent on fragile systems, revisiting these kinds of forbidden tactics is crucial. They show us that survival is not about following rules blindly, but about adaptation under pressure, about the courage to innovate when all conventional solutions fail. This single trick, the unauthorized modification of a B-25 Mitchell into a precision killing machine, saved thousands of lives and disrupted an entire enemy offensive. Without knowledge like this, none would have survived those brutal weeks on Bougainville. As these files reveal for the first time in decades, the unauthorized attack was not a rogue operation, but a landmark moment of survival instinct forged in the crucible of war. A lesson in the power of ingenuity under fire and the tragic consequences when innovation is stifled by fear. When the grid fails and an enemy, seen or unseen, closes in, such lessons become more than history. They become survival. What we once believed was disobedience was in fact the edge of human perseverance. A reminder that sometimes breaking the rules isn't just necessary, it's the only way to live to fight another day. This knowledge, now unclassified, must be preserved and shared, because in any prolonged emergency, the difference between life and death will always be the courage to defy limits, the willingness to adapt, and the refusal to accept a fate dictated from above. Remember Lieutenant Commander Jack Harris and his crew, not because they broke protocol, but because their unauthorized B-25 showed us how survival sometimes demands the impossible.